Hello, I'm Michael Boyer. I am here to present the research paper for ECE5831 for fall 2019. The paper I will be presenting is Recurrent Neural Network Regularization. So the agenda for today will be to go over the motivation and overview of the paper, go over some background concepts, find where this work relates to other work, go over the regularization of recurrent neural networks using dropout, then go through the experimental results that were proven to show the approach of using dropout on recurrent neural networks works well, and finally end with a conclusion. So the paper I'll be presenting is titled Recurrent Neural Network Regularization. It was written by some authors from the New York University, as well as some employees at Google working on the Google Brain project. It was published in September 2014 in the RX archive. So dropout is a successful and popular regularization technique which are used in feed-forward neural networks, but it does not work well with recurrent neural networks with long-term short memory units, otherwise known as LSTMs. This is because it disrupts the LSTM's longer-term pattern recognition. So the thesis of this paper is to introduce a simple dropout technique for recurrent neural networks with long short-term memory units. And they will improve generalization on a couple of different applications such as language modeling, speech recognition, image caption generation, and machine translation. So where does this work relate or fit into other work that's been done on regularization of neural networks and recurrent neural networks? Well, there's actually been quite a bit of analysis for regularization on feed-forward networks, but it's really not as plentiful on recurrent neural networks. The approach that was developed here was actually developed in parallel by other papers, so it's not entirely novel. But this paper shows more robust results on numerous applications than others. So some background concepts which are needed to understand the proposal in this paper. The first will be regularization. Regularization is essentially the approach to prevent overfitting of models, and it improves generalization. You can see here in this image that we're attempting to prevent overfitting and underfitting of the model and attempting to have some optimal solution that generalizes well to any set of data. So one of the most common regularization approaches is known as dropout. This is used very often in feed-forward networks. Basically what it does is it randomly disconnects edges and hidden layers in a model. As you can see in this image here, you randomly disconnect different edges between different hidden layers during training process with some probability of them being left out. And this actually causes the models to not rely on just one type of feature or pattern in the data and really just rely on multiple different patterns and features, so you're more likely to generalize well if you use this approach. So the next key concept to know is a recurrent neural network versus a feed-forward network and how they differ. So a recurrent neural network has recurrent edges which span adjacent time steps. Recurrent neural networks can use their internal state or memory to process the sequences of data. So basically they can start recognizing patterns throughout time rather than just one input feature vector. And this is visualized here in this image. You can see on the left that a hidden layer in a recurrent neural network is connected to itself, whereas in feed-forward networks, a hidden layer can only be connected to prior and latter hidden layers. So the next concept to know is long short-term memory cells. They are used in order to allow longer-term memory to be implemented when compared to typical recurrent neural networks. They are essentially a specific node inside of a hidden layer which contains special gates. And as you can see in this image here, these gates basically help accomplish the longer term memory by editing what's known as the memory cell's cell state, which is known as the cell's memory. It can carry relevant information through a long sequence of data if it goes unaffected. It can become unaffected by not allowing any cell state to be modified using input gates. So if the input data is deemed irrelevant, it won't affect the cell state. This is done through what's known as the input gate, which again prevents cell state from being affected by irrelevant data. The next gate can cause the cell state to be forgotten. That is why it's known as the forget gate. And all this does is resets the cell state if old information is not needed any longer. Then finally, there's the output gate, which decides what next hidden state should be based on the current cell state. So the last hidden layer input and the previous hidden layer value as outputs. And basically this just determines the next hidden layer value to pass at the output of this hidden layer. And as you can see, along with the next value to the next hidden layer, the cell state is also retained for the next step of training. So to better understand the problem that this paper attempts to solve, we have to understand why dropout doesn't work for recurrent neural networks. So first we remember that long short-term memory units aimed for longer-term memory in recurrent networks. So in this recurrent network, if we imagine at t equals 1 or t equals 0 rather, we have some input feature data which goes into the first hidden layer of our model, and we have a second hidden layer which basically the output of the first hidden layer goes to, and then we have some output data. But with our current network, right, we have actually inputs to that hidden layer at time 0 from the previous step. So if we think about, well, we're going to have basically connected edges if we're not using dropouts, so that way our hidden layer values kind of continue throughout time and are not affected at different time steps. But now if we think, well, let's use dropout to drop one of our recurrent edges, right? Well, we've now dropped this edge, and we no longer have the connection between the hidden layer at time equals 0 to that same hidden layer at time equals time t plus 1. And what this effectively does is it actually causes all of the following time steps to also be heavily affected, which really causes a problem because the dropout on recurrent edges actually disrupts the long-term sequence information storage that these long short-term memory units attempt to achieve. And this is really the problem that this paper tries to solve. So the proposal that this paper has to overcome this problem is essentially to only drop out non-recurrent network edges. So if we think about from the last slide, right, if we are no longer dropping these solid recurrent edges, well, we would never really have any problems with losing any memory because our hidden layer values would be unaffected through different timestamps, and they would only be affected by the input data, really, dropouts. And so the proposal is pretty simple. It's essentially to just drop out only the non-recurrent edges, the regular network edges from our model, which is really just acting very much like a normal feed-forward dropout approach. And that is the proposal of this paper. And so to kind of prove this point, if we leave recurrent edges unaffected, we can actually have long-term memory storage that is also unaffected. So to visualize that here, if we have some input feature data at t minus 2, and we have dropped out maybe all other 4 of our normal model edges, we have some hidden layer information that gets stored and output and used in the next time step. And if we leave these recurrent edges unaffected, we actually have the ability to carry it throughout time. And even so, it can, basically go from hidden layer to hidden layer at different time steps and continue to the output eventually at t plus 2, basically allowing us to say that this input feature at t minus 2 somehow made an impact on t plus 2. Whereas if we had dropped out some of these recurrent edges in that training process, this input feature vector at t minus 2 would have not made an effect on the output features and t plus 2. So in order to prove that this approach actually works, they took a task known as natural language modeling first to show some experimental results that regularized models perform better than non-regularized models. So here the natural language modeling is particularly concerned with how to program computers to process and analyze large amounts of natural language data. So one of the most well-known and used data sets in this field is the PennTree data bank data set, which was used. The goal of this task is really just to accurately predict words in sentences. The score of the output is based on the word's perplexity. Here the perplexity meaning the inability to deal with or understand something complicated or unaccountable. So this means that a lower score would indicate lower perplexity, which is better. A higher score means greater inability to deal with or understand something. So if we have a look at some of the results here on the right in this table, and for simplicity, we'll highlight some of the best regularized models and non-regularized models. In red will be the non-regularized models, and in green will be the regularized models. And so basically you can see that a non-regularized model was trained and optimized, but needed to actually stay small due to inability to generalize well because no regularization method was applied. So you can see that this only 10 non-regularized LSTMs versus 38 is because that 10 non-regularized LSTMs is the best performance they could achieve without regularizing. And that's kind of the point here is you now can build larger networks that have better performance by using regularization. And yeah, so in both the single model and model averaging approaches used, the regularized networks outperformed the optimized non-regularized networks, and they were even able to prove that they were state-of-the-art and performed better than some of the state-of-the-art papers which have been presented in the past, such as Mikolov and Zwiak. So the second task they chose for experimental results to prove this approach works well is speech recognition, particularly acoustic modeling, which is a key component in mapping acoustic signals to sequences of word. So one of the useful metrics for this is known as the frame accuracy, which generally correlates to the more important word error rate, but this is more difficult to achieve just based on the amount of tuning needed. And here they used the Icelandic data set actually, which is relatively small and is really concerned with overfitting. So the training and validation metrics for frame level accuracy shown in this model, again showing the different colors here, shows that the regularized model generalizes better than the non-regularized model, which is exactly what we expect. And this is really impressive due to the size of this data set. We're really showing that you can obtain good performance much better than if you are not using regularization. So the third task that they chose to prove experimental results was machine translation, which is a language modeling task, where the task is to assign a high probability to a correct translation of a source sentence. The dataset they used for this task was the WMT 2014 English to French dataset, which has 340 million words in it. And what they did is they trained the same model, but one with regularized LSTMs and one without. And basically with the 20% dropout rate, you can see in the same colors that they were actually able to achieve a lower test perplexity on the regularized model, which proves that their regularized approach caused the model to perform better and generalize better when compared to the non-regularized model. And the final task which they attempted to use to prove the experimental results was known as the generation of captions for images. Basically, the data set they used was known as MS-COCO, and it was selected again due to the smaller size, which would show the proof of regularization and would prove that models were not being overfit. So if we look at the results again, we can see that the regularized model performs similar to ensemble techniques used. Basically, the non-regularized model has a higher test perplexity than the regularized model, proving that regularization is better than non-regularization here. And even with an ensemble technique of using 10 different non-regularized models, we are still achieving about the same performance or relatively same performance as those ensemble techniques, which really shows you that you have almost the same performance but with a much lower training time and complexity, which really will help speed up training of models. So with the experimental results now all presented, conclusion, basically we now have seen that dropout is a very common regularization technique used in feed-forward networks and really helps models generalize better. And the proposed solution was to use this same approach only on hidden layer integers that are not recurrent as candidates for dropout regularization. And of course, with the experimental results, you can improve the effectiveness in generalization of regularized models compared to non-regularized models. And even using more complicated ensemble techniques of non-regularized models might be able to perform better than the regularized models. You still can achieve similar results with significantly less training effort and significantly less model complexity. So So thank you for listening.